Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to Naval Ravikant. And this is part 2 of my conversation with Naval about existential risks. Part 1 went up a couple days ago. Depending on where you are in the world, it was probably time-stamped March 19th, although in a few places it may be time-stamped March 18th. Either way, if you haven't heard part 1 yet, you may want to give it a listen first. It should be positioned immediately before this episode in your podcast player. If it isn't, you can find it on my website, which is at after-on.com, or you can just listen to this part first with no characters or storylines to keep track of. It's not imperative that you listen to the 2 sections in order. One quick thing, as those of you who have heard part 1 will know, the catalyst for this conversation with Naval was a 4-part article that I wrote, which Medium.com published behind their paywall back in October. It's by no means necessary that you read that in order to enjoy listening to today's conversation, but if at some point you'd like to, you should be able to access it via my Twitter feed, whether you're a paying Medium subscriber or not. Specifically, over the past few days, I've tweeted links to all 4 parts of that article from my Twitter account, which is at Rob_Reed, R-E-I-D. And if you click on the links in Twitter, you should be spirited right past Medium's paywall and directly to the writing. At least that's what I've been told. And now, without further ado, part 2 of my conversation with Naval Ravikant.
At any given time on the planet, there's a few people. One is too many.
One is too many.
If you gave them a button that would end this planet, they would press the button.
If there were such a button, and one day everybody woke up and they had access to that button,
the world would have to be a very civilized place.
Yeah.
You would basically have to make everybody really happy. But that's what we're talking about. In a long enough time scale, everyone's going to have that button. Again, long enough time scale, that's where we're headed. So going back to the physicists for a second, one of our favorites, Enrico Fermi, is well known for the Fermi paradox. And the Fermi paradox is, well, if the universe is so large and it's so old, how come we haven't encountered any other intelligent life yet? And for a little while, we had this very parochial point of view, which seemed like an offshoot of the hypothesis that the Earth was the center of the universe before Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler disabused us of that. People used to have this notion, well, the Earth is unique. The Earth is special. There's only one planet with water and with life. But now we've found thousands, tens of thousands of planets as we launch bigger and bigger telescopes that are capable of bearing life. So the universe is littered with them. And we've only been around as a civilization for 5,000-7,000 years. We've only been around as a species for a few 100,000 years. We've only been around as life on this planet for a few billion years. Where is everybody? I actually think the most likely plausible explanation is the Great Filter hypothesis. And the Great Filter hypothesis is that any sufficiently advanced civilization blows itself up.
When people started first wrestling with that possibility back probably in the 50s when the Drake equation was first created that asked how many advanced civilizations might be out there, they were thinking in terms of nuclear danger. But today we're seeing other technologies that are on the intermediate or even near-term horizon that could also potentially have an annihilating impact.
Yeah, before we even get to our favorite topic, synbio, which is,
Yes.
I think, where much of the near-term danger comes from. On the Great Filter hypothesis, there's another one that was recently popularized by, I believe, Cixin Liu. Apologies if I get his name wrong, but famous sci-fi author. He wrote The 3-Body Problem. He has a hypothesis called the dark forest hypothesis, where the universe is like a dangerous dark forest that we're all tiptoeing through. And whoever makes a noise identifies themselves to the other predators in the forest, who immediately kill it, because we all have killing power, and first strikes are so powerful in a technologically advanced society that whoever finds the other one first, instead of saying hello, they just wipe you out just in case.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite of the Prime Directive from Star Trek. The problem with the dark forest hypothesis is that any species that is capable of destroying another species immediately on contact was first capable of destroying itself. So how did it make it through that whole situation, through that great filter? And the only solution I can come up with is not a great one, but it's the Borg solution, which is you all become one thing. I don't try to kill myself. You don't try to kill yourself. Even though individual cells may go rogue, they don't have the ability to shut your whole body down. because we've decided the unit is one thing and has a central intelligence and a central command.
Is the presumption that Borg-like intelligences would, in an abundance of caution, annihilate any species that they came across?
On that one, I'm a little optimistic because I think to become a Borg-like civilization, you would have to have become pacifist first.
Yeah, in order to survive to that
That's
level
right.
of
You
development.
would care more about the collective.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned SynBio. To me, the powerful example is the Human Genome Project, which is really technically a step before synthetic biology. It's about reading DNA matter rather than altering it. But there's sometimes referred to as the Carlson curve, which is the curve that traces how rapidly the price and performance improves in the realm of genomic sequencing and synthetic biology in general. And it makes the Moore's Law curve of computing look pokey. And so the statistic is the Human Genome Project ended in 2003. It took 13 years. It cost about $3 billion. It involved thousands of the top scientists throughout the world. And its result was a single haploid genome. And today, substantially more work can be achieved for about $1,000, so 1/3 millionth the cost of the Human Genome Project, by a lone lab tech, which might very well be an undergrad or even a high school kid, working with the proper equipment in the span of about a day or maybe 2 days. So that's the rate of improvement that we have. And in contemplating what might become possible with synthetic biology, particularly viewing it through this grim lens that we're looking at things through right now, try to imagine the field of synthetic biology today, everything that it's doing that's amazing with CRISPR and with other technologies. Imagine the total output of that field over the coming 15 years. Who knows what it'll be, but we can imagine it'll be profound. And then imagine that unit of work, that which the entire field achieves in 15 years, eventually becoming an easy day's work for a lone undergraduate. Would that be a more or less stable world than a world of thousands of sovereign nuclear powers? Because if we had gotten as good and efficient with nukes after the Manhattan Project, you would have had nuclear weapons in thousands of garages and college laboratories by the mid-1960s, right?
Synthetic biology will be the first one to deliver world-ending capability to individuals.
It'll come before nanotechnology.
Yeah, nanotech is still way off.
And other technologies that sometimes people cite as potentially having very asymmetric powers in the future include geoengineering.
There's always a possibility for a black swan. By definition, they're unpredictable, but just the clear current progress rate of synthetic bio may have already gotten us there. You had this horrific example you gave about how they modified one of the flu viruses.
Yeah, and this was in the ancient year of 2011. So this is the kind of thing that not only could be done, but has been done, and has been done with tools that are, by today's standards, relatively primitive. So back in 2011, researchers in Holland and Wisconsin were working with something called H5N1 flu. Now, H5N1 flu is literally 3,000 times more lethal than swine flu. And swine flu is very rightly feared. But H5N1 kills 60% of the people that it infects, whereas swine flu kills 0.02% of the people it infects. So 3,000 times more lethal. The one thing we can like about H5N1 flu, it is not very contagious at all. That's why there's only been, I believe, a few dozen deaths from H5N1 flu in the entire history of the world. What these researchers did is they created a highly contagious version of H5N1. And they kept it under lock and key, and they did it as part of a virology experiment. These weren't bad guys. But the journal Science, writing about this experiment, and Science is one of the two most revered publications in the world of scientific research, the other being Nature. The news arm of the journal Science wrote, this strain could, quote, change world history if it were set free by triggering a pandemic of, again, quote, quite possibly with many millions of deaths. And at the same time, there was a person whose title was the U.S. National Science Advisory Board Chairman for Biosecurity. His name was Paul Keim. He said, I can't think of another pathogenic organism that is as scary as this one. I don't think anthrax is scary at all compared to this. And this guy was an anthrax expert. So that happened back in 2011. Now, there's an optimistic way of viewing this, which is that this was a very carefully sequestered critter. It was probably deep in some biosafety vault on both sides of the Atlantic. And there was no way it was going to teleport into your Caesar salad tomorrow. Another way of looking at it is they created basically very tiny data files. The whole flu genome is about 15,000 letters. That's very, very small. And the number of modifications that went into this particular mod, I don't know, but my guess is they could probably fit on a Post-it note. And anybody who gets their hands on that tiny list of changes whether it's in 2011, today, or 30 years in the future, would have a trivially easy time reanimating that particularly contagious strain of H5N1. Now, 2011 was before CRISPR was invented. CRISPR is an editing technology which has radically enabled and radically eased the process of editing a genome. And it is diffused to the point where CRISPR is widely practiced in high-end high school biology labs. And I'd say that's a good thing. I think synthetic biology has an enormous amount of promise for humans, and it should be taught to young folks, etc. But there is this terrible danger that as this proliferates, there will be more and more turbocharged pathogens generated.
What we've basically done is with synthetic biology, we've taken designing and hacking humans from the physical domain to the digital domain. It's a similar problem that people keep creating new computer viruses, but unlike computers, when a human crashes, it's fatal. There's no reboot.
And I think it's safe to guess that a desktop DNA synthesizer from the year 2038 will be capable of things that the entire project of synthetic biology is incapable of today. And there's a writer named Richard Preston who wrote a book that some people probably know called The Hot Zone. He's written fiction that's based on bioterror and bioerror. He's written science fact that's based on bioterror and bioerror. And the quote of his that resonates with me is this: "The main thing that stands between the human species and the creation of a supervirus is a sense of responsibility among the individual biologists. And the danger is that we'll become vulnerable to the ethics of ever larger groups of people. We were vulnerable to the ethics of 2 people in 2011. They were good guys. They were actually virologists. Today, there's probably hundreds of people who, enabled by CRISPR, could do the things that were done in 2011. And at some point, that's going to extend to the world's elite life science grad students. And at some point, it's going to extend beyond them."
It seems like this is one of those fears that is almost built into the human species. We all realize that this at some level. Everyone watches zombie movies. Why? It's basically warning you what to do when the plague comes. Now, when the real plague comes, unfortunately, I don't think people will look gray and green and be lumbering around slowly. They'll be your loved ones coughing and feeling sick very quickly. Or if it's an engineered virus, it could be something that shows no symptoms until everybody drops dead 10 days later. So we do have some sense of alarm already built into our science fiction genres. I would argue that science fiction and movies actually warn people. Peter Thiel famously critiqued sci-fi because he said there's no more optimistic sci-fi. In the 50s and 60s, we had all this optimistic sci-fi. Star Trek was very positive and optimistic. But nowadays, it's all apocalyptic and negative. And I think that's because a lot of filmmakers rightly recognize that we are approaching a singularity, but a singularity of a different kind, where a single individual can end everything.
Yeah, and particularly when we start talking about synthetic biology, I worry more about the lone nihilist than the organized terror groups, because with relatively few exceptions, and really the only exception I've been able to identify was called Aum Shinrikyo. They famously attacked the Tokyo subway with sarin gas back in the 90s. But generally speaking, terror groups are discriminate by nature. And the kind of attack that you would carry out with synthetic biology or perhaps with nanotechnology, some other things, are indiscriminate by nature. So I do worry more about the lone nihilist.
I'll give you a worse scenario. I don't
Please.
think it requires a lone nihilist. I think you can actually easily assemble a group of nihilists.
Once again, you've said, pessimistic as you are, Rob, you're being too optimistic here. So tell me how you assemble.
I'm not trying to be a pessimist. I don't want to create World War III or...
The reason we're having this conversation is I don't think you're a pessimist. I actually think you're a realist.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in human freedoms, and I'm not convinced that we need to start forbidding things.
Quite the opposite, as we'll discuss.
Right. But I think it's quite easy to organize a group to work on this. There are multiple groups in history that have been wiped out, that have been eradicated, genocided. And very often, groups of people have essentially all committed mass suicide because they knew they were going to die. So there's a famous one with some Jews who were surrounded by the Romans, and rather than let themselves be enslaved by the Romans, they killed their own families, drew straws, and then killed themselves. When India was being invaded by Islam, castles that were under siege, when they were falling, everybody inside would kill themselves. Now, the worst scenario, again, popular movies and literature so far ahead of us, is the Dr. Strangelove scenario. Dr. Strangelove, the movie, came out after the nuclear weapons were created in World War II. And the fear was that the US and the Soviet Union had created doomsday devices. Doomsday devices basically said, don't try and kill me, because if you kill me, this automatically goes off and kills everybody. The problem is that doomsday devices will not stop at the nation-state level. They'll populate to the group level. So if you are in a subgroup, a minority, that is being eliminated and eradicated, What you may do is create a doomsday device, and you say, if we get taken out, everybody gets taken out. And this is where you can get a group of intelligent people together to work on the problem.
That's
really
you could
have a
interesting.
proliferation of multiple doomsday devices.
Using the Masada example, which is the one from Jewish history, you could hypothetically say, well, if the state of Israel was about to get annihilated,
exactly,
if they
might unveil a doomsday device. They might say, oh, by the way, we got one of these. And then it turns out so do the North Koreans, and so do the Kurds, and so does ISIS, and so on and so forth.
And so do smaller and smaller groups. I mean, it might be the Rohingya in Burma, in Myanmar, who decide to create such a thing.
So if you can get sufficient group loyalty, it's very easy to create a suicide cult. Even the anti-natalists, they're extreme environmentalists who might go in on this because they're like, well, humans are kind of the plague that's infesting the earth, and let's get rid of humans, and it goes back to paradise.
Yeah.
And again, movies warn about this. If you remember 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam's famous thriller about a synbio attack, or 28 Days Later, the zombie movie.
And one reason why my delusion that it would really be nihilist individuals that we needed to be concerned about was soothing to me is because groups are, of course, far more dangerous than individuals because they can pool skills and they can be in more places than one at once.
They can do it with current or close to current technology.
Yeah. And when I think about the lone nihilist, I worry about people like the person who shot up that theater in Aurora, Colorado. It was a Batman premiere, the guy who famously dressed as the Joker. He was an elite life sciences PhD student. So he was in that relatively narrow circle of people that we would have to worry about because as time passes and a group of people grows, the odds of somebody from that group doing something terrible and bizarre and completely off the rails goes somewhere from being slim to being somewhere like high to being somewhere like near certainty. Okay, so we've posed this terrible instability that we believe to varying degrees lies in the intermediate future. You're probably more pessimistic than I am. I believe there are things that we can do to preclude
solutions.
this.
Yeah. I have a set of potential solutions, but it's just not the world I want to live in. So I'm in denial in that sense.
I don't want the extreme ones. And so here's what I think we need to do. You talked about Dr. Strangelove. I think that's a very powerful example. We did survive the Cold War. And I think part of the reason for that was we got very good at telling ourselves ghost stories. We got very good at freaking out in a way that turned out to be very, very productive.
That is a great point. I mean, the first thing I worried about even doing this podcast is, should we be sounding an alarm? Do we want to be alarmist? And the problem is if you stick your head in the sand, it's not going away. As you said, this is on the Carlson curve.
The Carlson curve, yes.
Which is much steeper than Moore's law curve.
Much steeper.
This is not even like AGI where it's theoretical. It's sort of inevitable.
It's coming.
So at this point, one way out of this is to create such an allergic and immune response in every human that when they get the idea that someone is capable of something like this, that it just creates an immune response for the whole species, right? Where essentially every cell in the body becomes a white blood cell. And that may buy us quite a bit of time. I have young kids. I want people to be aware. I want people to be on their guard for it, rather than having some horribly catastrophic thing that happens that's sort of a near miss, which wakes us up. Because the crackdown in the wake of that could be far worse. We lost 3,000 people on 9/11, and we're still paying for it today in terms of lost freedoms and all these extra wars that we ended up fighting. Better to be informed and prepared.
You've just said two things that make me think of immune systems. First of all, you had said all of us could be white blood cells to counteract this kind of attack. And I really love that analogy because, first of all, obviously, none of us would survive even a day without our immune systems. And our immune systems, they get trained up when they get exposed to new viruses. And training the societal immune system to start having some awareness and some concern about these scenarios now is maybe akin to giving a vaccine of some sort.
Yeah, it's a very interesting problem, and immune systems have to be trained very, very carefully.
And then the other thing is what you just said about 9/11. That's the immune system overreacting. If you die of a sepsis infection, it's usually because your immune system overreacted to an extent that it started causing damage to your organs. On a more narrow level, there's something called a cytokine response storm. That's something that happens sometimes in immunotherapy. Cytokines are things that signal the immune system to make more and more white blood cells. And sometimes you get into a situation where there are so many of these signals going out to make more and more white blood cells that the body essentially creates a crippling number of white blood cells and then kills itself. And so the 9/11 example you just cited is an extreme case of that. Like, we didn't nip the initial infection in the bud, and then we had this radical sepsis-like overreaction of spending trillions of dollars and killing a lot more than 3,000 people.
And the Patriot Act, what it did to our freedoms, which are still gone to this day, and we just live now in a surveillance state, which is now all forgiven because of 9/11. In fact, when 9/11 happened that day at work, I said to one of my coworkers, I said, oh, there's going to be a war over this. I didn't know who, I didn't know where. And I was wrong. There were two. In a drone strike on a commercial aviation scenario, you could easily imagine that the overreaction that we have afterwards may be worse than the actual initial problem.
And so that's why you have to follow this very, very careful and narrow balance between training the immune system to recognize a new threat, which is really all what we're talking about today. A lone wolf or a small organization doing terrible things with new technologies. But the reason that you really have to train that immune system is if even a failed attack gets through, the overreaction could be what really, really cripples us. If you consider the worst possible synbio attack to be something that is eradicating of all of us, right? Something that could be a trivial failure on that scale, it kills 1% of us, could just cripple society.
It's very hard to do these counterfactuals. For example, 9/11, the response to that may be an overreaction, but in a parallel universe, it could have turned out if we hadn't had that reaction, then they would have gotten their hands on a nuclear weapon. It's impossible to say. So the immune system is going to react the way it's going to react. But I agree with you in that training it is very important. We don't want everyone to be Big Brother, every neighbor spying on everyone and constantly surveilling and reporting on everyone. That's a nightmare scenario. But at the same time, these new categories of technologies just enable a new category of threats that the immune system has to be trained to recognize and then respond to. So what are the things that one can do? I like your idea of ghost stories.
Yeah.
For example, Ex Machina, if you remember that movie.
Brilliant movie.
Brilliant movie. It's about an AGI threat. We have the zombie movies. It's been a while since I've seen a good synbio threat movie.
It has been a while. So to just go briefly back to the Cold War example, we did tell ourselves these terrible ghost stories with names like War Games and Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe and On the Beach. And as a result of that, everybody knew what the worst case stakes were.
There was a time shortly after World War II when both the Soviet Union and the US believed that a nuclear war was winnable.
Yes, exactly. And we cured ourselves by that by talking about it and fearing it and working very, very hard on contingency plans.
And it took scenarios like nuclear winters to show that even a small number of nuclear weapons being detonated in the atmosphere could end all life on Earth. When it comes to plague stuff, we've lost track. Like, plagues in human history used to be far, far, far worse. There was a plague in 536, they've now discovered, AD. Between a third and a half of the people in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Roman Empire, were believed to have died from plague. Think of a half or a third of all the people you know dying of plague.
Yeah, and what's chilling about that is just thinking about how less resilient society is today. I mean, if you could imagine some kind of a synbio or other attack grievously sickening, let's say, 1% of the population. Most cities don't even have a fifth that much hospital bed capacity. Whereas in the Middle Ages, people were tough enough to shake off the deaths of 5, 10, 20, 30% of their neighbors. I don't know what happens in an American urban area when 80% of the people who are stampeding a hospital, life-threatening situations, are turned away for lack of beds.
One analogy to this is World War II. World War II was highly devastating for communities that were fairly built up from a civilizational perspective, not as much as we are today. And they seemed to toughen up when they needed to because there is no other option. But we are now much more densely packed in urban areas. We have much more complex supply chains for even basic necessities like food and water and power. So if we were out of food and water and power, for example, in Manhattan, it would be a complete disaster, much more so than it would have been in the Manhattan of 100 years ago.
Yeah, and it seems like we have these single service dependencies, for lack of a better word, today. If the power goes out, completely out, that shuts down pretty much everything. The food starts spoiling, the cops can't communicate with one another, there's no way to navigate after dark, all exits from a city are going to be blocked.
Yeah, we've used civilization to put humans in more precarious locations than they would have been otherwise. Whether it's living on the floodplain or living in the desert or living behind bridges, behind single roads or air delivery, there's just a lot more humans who could be stranded.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking about what it would be like to be invaded in 1939. I would imagine even in Northern Europe, there were very, very large sections of cities that were unelectrified, or at least people that were living without electricity probably had fairly recent memories of being without it. People were just much closer to living more directly off of the earth and more directly by their hands and the sweat of their labor than we are today. But biological attack that fell radically short of the worst case scenario could just be so devastating because of the knock-on effect.
Well, biological attacks create a level of fear that it is ongoing that other kinds of problems don't. So, for example, if there is a earthquake, after the earthquake is passed, everybody comes out to help everybody else. But if there's a plague or a biological attack, everyone goes into hiding and nobody wants to help anybody else because they get sick too.
Which brings us to this amazing term you came up with when we were exchanging emails about my series of essays on these topics and later tweeted, and it resonated with a lot of people, which was the ender.
Yeah, I believe that if you want to get a message out, you sort of have to brand it and you have to put it in terms that people can easily synthesize, understand immediately, and transmit. Like you said, the Terminator scenario, the Skynet scenario for AI, everybody knows what that is, so it's very easy to communicate. And to me, the idea of an individual trying to kill everyone on Earth, this person is an ender. And I'm riffing a little bit off of that book, Ender's Game. It doesn't quite mean the same thing.
I thought it was a brilliant term when you came up with that. I'd been thinking about these topics, I won't say nonstop, but an awful lot for a couple of months because I was writing those 4 long essays for Medium that wrestled with it. And I'd sent you the first draft of the first one or something like that, and we started lobbing emails back and forth, and you came up with this really, really powerful term because it is so succinct. It has an echo of something that we're familiar with, but we've just spent most of the last hour defining the ender. And so it is a complicated topic that could benefit a great deal from traveling with just a couple of words and a few syllables. Another analogy I think I've mentioned to you before is this phrase, the tipping point. It's a powerful phrase. Probably most educated people understand what it means and have used it. And the fact is that term has a birth date. It was coined by Malcolm Gladwell in an essay in The New Yorker, probably 20-something years ago, and he defined what a tipping point was. He came up with the term, and it's a great little essay, later titled a book after it. I'd be surprised if more than 1% of the people who successfully use that term actually read the essay. It's a complicated term, and it conveys a great deal. And so I could now say, hey, the tipping point in this market or in this political situation or whatever it was came at such and such a time when such and such happened. And now all of a sudden, thousands of words of defining something has been collapsed into something very concise. More sophisticated conversations can be held. The trouble is, does it become aspirational? Like, is the term too good?
Right. We don't want it to become aspirational. It's not something I want to see exist, and nor do I want to turn it into some sort of biblical prophecy where then people are looking forward to the ender, because there's always some psychopaths out there who are. But I think it's important for us to recognize that these kinds of people exist. I wouldn't lionize it. It's not a positive thing, right? This is obviously a terrible, unloved, unlovable person, to the extent that if they succeed, obviously no one's around to applaud them.
Yes.
And if they fail, they'll be the most hated and reviled person in history. So they're not doing themselves or their progeny or their friends or family or even their ideologies any favors, because they're forever going to be associated with a horrible thing. And let's face it, most of them are going to be inept.
It's one more chance to fail.
So I think every time any one of them fails, the ideal would be to not give them any attention. But as we've shown through terrorism, we don't really do that. We give it a lot of attention. But I think the way to look upon this character is like a Gollum-type character from Lord of the Rings, this pathetic, evil, bumbling, inept character that no one should aspire to be. But at the same time, it is important to get the message out. We need terminology and vocabulary to be able to communicate. We need to be able to transmit the information, to absorb it, and to keep an eye out for it. And if someone says, hey, I think so-and-so wants to be an ender, that gets the point across to how we should investigate that person.
Gollum is actually a really, really good example. I hadn't thought of that one. Nobody wants to be Gollum when kids go around playing the Hobbit.
Yeah, I mean, a real ender is likely to be a Gollum-type character. Someone who is warped and distorted, unhappy and miserable.
Another term might be for the failed ender. I was thinking last night, enderlings. Like an enderling is somebody who tries and fails. And most people are going to fail spectacularly in this objective.
Some combination of credible attack by an ender.
Enderling.
Thank you, enderling. Combined with the cytokine response could take out a lot of humanity and civil society as we know it.
Which is why we need to marshal our immune system against enderlings, because there's going to be thousands of them for every ender, and hopefully there'll be an infinite ratio, because I think if we think hard enough about it and early enough about it, there won't be an ender. But people have been attempting to kill as many people as possible in the act of dying for as long as we have records.
This is going to be a little sappy, but my conclusion is that you're not going to be able to stop them purely through surveillance or creating a totalitarian society or Big Brother watching, because that creates its own immune response. And you're not going to be able to stop them by stopping technology for all the reasons we've already talked about. So really the only way is to not create them in the first place.
Yeah.
And to not create them means that we all just need to learn how to make sure nobody goes unloved. The one part where the immune system analogy breaks down a little bit here is we're not talking about an external threat to the human body. We're talking about an internal threat to the human body. So it's more like a cancer cell.
Yeah.
Exactly. So don't let cancer arrive in the first place.
Although one of the things that I learned at this wedding over the weekend is that our immune system actually is taking out cancer constantly.
That's true.
It does successfully rally itself, and it's only when cancer gets out of control and figures out a way to foil the immune system that it goes away. So a cancer cell is still something that an immune system can rally against. And I think you've really just hit on the first layer, if we can talk about it like a communication stack. The first layer is making sure that people don't feel unloved and
Prevention
alone
in the first place.
That's the first layer. The second thing is also really inexpensive. I'll just call it imagination, for lack of a better term. The 9/11 example is a really, really strong one where we lacked that least expensive input of imagination. When I look at that, I can't say that it was a lack of foresight, because we had actually hardened the airports throughout the world in reaction to terrorism in the 1970s. It wasn't a lack of resources, because the world governments have probably literally spent trillions of dollars preventing a sequel to 9/11 since it happened. So we can't say we were impoverished for resources. We can't say it was for a lack of brain power, because although Osama bin Laden was very charismatic, he had a great deal of money, he had a lot of strengths, nobody ever thought that he was an Einstein-level genius. So he came up with a non-ingenious plan, and the team that he then assigned it to is fairly underpowered. They're not very comfortable navigating in this alien society that they find themselves in, probably not any more than I would be trying to navigate my way through Saudi Arabia. They're a fairly scrawny lot. They're not all that bright. A lot of the people didn't even realize that they were on a suicide mission, and they pull this thing off. So on our side, we had the resources, we had the foresight, we had the brain power, but we never gave anyone the job of supplying the imagination. We might have, populated a conference room with a bunch of really smart people from a bunch of different cultural backgrounds, probably overrepresenting parts of the world that had had a lot of experience with terrorism in 2001. That would have been Sri Lanka, maybe still Ireland, certainly the Middle East. As a country of immigrants, we get to tap into all kinds of perspectives, and just said, hey, you guys in this conference room, what you do 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, we can give you all the pizza and beer that you need. You just sit down and think really hard about the low-tech, cheap things that relatively underfunded, understaffed, undergeniused organizations like Al-Qaeda might be able to pull off, and just use your imagination. Like, okay, we're dealing with terrorists. What have they done a lot of? Well, since the 80s, there's been a lot of suicide attacks, starting in Lebanon, kind of in a military situation. Okay, so suicide attacks. Well, they hijack a lot of planes. That's thing number 2. Maybe you have 7 things on the board, right? But you don't have 1,000 things. And then you start thinking, well, what's some crazy suicide airplane thing? Have we ever seen such a thing? And then hopefully somebody would say, yeah, there were 3,000 of them in the biggest war in American imagination, World War II. They were called kamikazes. That doesn't feel like a terribly expensive investment. Just having some smart people ideating on what could be done with the tools that we have now and the tools that we have 5 years hence.
Yeah, generally, governments only tend to react to something after it's happened. They're not proactive. They're not known for that. Private industry tends to be better at being proactive. This Gatwick drone incident does increase the odds that now you will have governments thinking about what do drones mean for commercial aviation. I should add as a disclaimer that I am an investor in one company, SkySafe, that helps with security against drones, but it's a tiny investment. And the reality is, although I think they're good for some things, I don't think they can stop many of the scenarios that we mentioned from happening. And there are other great drone security companies out there as well. I think Drone Shield is another one of them. I think Airware has some software.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, you probably have several hundred small investments in various startups,
Yes,
something like that.
that's
So
correct.
I'm personally confident that there is zero chance that this entire conversation has been an ingenious manipulation by you to get SkySafe equity more valuable. But you are
If that was the case, they owe me a lot more stock.
you a lot more stock. But you are very, very good to note that. It's always good to hoist a flag over potential conflicts.
But back to my original point, the drone incident at Gatwick means that governments will start trying to develop an immune response.
Yeah, governments might start getting ham-fisted and reactive, but we could also probably count on companies like DJI, really powerful drone companies, to say, oh my God, I don't want to be eradicated here. I don't want to be regulated out of existence. I'm going to start an immune response as well. An interesting example might be the film industry. There was concern that the government was going to start regulating. So the industry came up with its own PG, PG-13, rated G, et cetera, standards. I think that the best defense, particularly when we talk about synthetic biology, can and should come from the industry itself and even from the professors in universities that train the people who are going into the industry. That euphemistic conference room in which people are constantly thinking about what could be done and what we could do now to protect against this, that should be part of the discipline of synthetic biology. And if that is to some degree formalized in training and it's formalized in sort of industry associations and maybe something like the W3C, only for SynBio, that has regular meetings, that could be potentially our most powerful weapon against this.
Something like AI, less likely, much further away, but it's scary because there's no time to develop an immune response.
It's too late once it happens.
It's instant when it happens, exactly. And even something like a major SynBio attack could get to a catastrophic level very quickly. We haven't really seen minor designer SynBio attacks yet.
Well, I'll actually give you the example that kind of proves the rule. The anthrax attacks in 2001 are really seared in my memory because as it happened, I was in the Senate Majority Leader's office, Tom Daschle, the day that a letter arrived at Daschle's office with anthrax in it. That particular letter didn't infect anybody, but several people were killed. And it ultimately was traced back to a very, very senior weapons researcher. And that's a chilling precedent when you think about it. We were probably as well organized of a military-industrial complex as the world has ever seen. And we, even with all of our good intentions and open society and strong protection measures, we couldn't prevent some highly weaponized anthrax from getting out of one of our biolabs and into the office of the Senate Majority Leader. We couldn't do that. So how can we expect an entire diffused industry of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of SynBio experts? How can we expect all of that diffusion to keep a lid on itself? It only can happen with a multi-level immune response, starting with looking after people so they don't feel unloved. Secondly, by infusing this imagination into the industry and also into government and elsewhere.
Then next comes the training of the immune system, which is any attack that does happen or was attempted to happen, we figure out what that looked like, what we can learn from it, and we start training pockets of people around the world to keep an eye out for these things and respond to them. Ideally, we could also crowdsource it, filtering the air for any unknown new pathogens. You had George Church, you had a great podcast with him where he talked about essentially scanners that can figure out what's in the room, that can map viruses crossing a globe in real time. And these can be privatized almost, like buildings can install them. The new Teslas have these amazing biodefense HEPA filters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a bioweapons defense mode in the new Tesla where you hit a button and the AQI comes down to 7, even when I'm driving through the current smoke-laden Bay Area. Why aren't those installed in every new house? These are all short to medium term, and I think these are all things that we need to do. But if you're talking about long-term solutions, this is a horrible dystopian one. I don't want to live in it. But you're born and there's a chip implanted inside of you and it basically monitors your mood. And the moment you get actually suicidal, it just turns you off.
Talking about the storytellers who've prefigured certain things, that almost sounds like the V-chip of South Park times 100.
Right, exactly. The problem is this would be a totalitarian nightmare. But maybe there's a more benign version of it where instead of surveillance from above, it's surveillance from below, where it's all of us keeping tabs on each other. Now, unfortunately, this turned into a neighborhood watch creepy thing where it's like your neighbors are watching you. But if someone is going suicidal, especially if they're a life sciences PhD student, you don't necessarily treat them as someone who should just get help. It's someone who should actually be watched and maybe even put inside an institution until they are better. I think there's the obvious practical stuff of just being far more careful and regulated about who gets access to these facilities, these technologies, and this know-how. but even that's only going to work for so long.
For me, I get my relative optimism, first of all, from some of those examples from the past, like getting through the Cold War. And there's also the positive aspect that we outnumber this hypothetical person or group that might want to bring the curtains down on humanity by a factor of several billion to one. There's more of us, and we're thinking about this earlier. And these people who detonate in a rampage murder way, when they go off, they tend to grab the implements at hand. That's why there's so many mass shootings in the United States, mass stabbings in China. Occasionally, the thing that's at hand might be the throttle of an airplane. But this isn't an aspirational career.
It's true. You don't learn to fly a plane so you can fly it into the ground.
Exactly. When somebody snaps, as they have done in thousands of well-documented cases, they tend to grab the implements at hand with the training they already have. Now, sometimes they might plan and scheme for a period of days, maybe even weeks, I don't know, maybe even months. But it's not like you have an adult Stewie Griffin, the evil baby in Family Guy, that spends decades positioning him or herself to annihilate the entire world. If Andreas Lubitz, the Germanwings pilot, wasn't a pilot, he might have gone crazy with a knife because he was in Germany. He probably couldn't get a machine gun at retail, right? He wouldn't have gone to flight school for 4 years and worked his way into the position that he could do his thing. So the immune system that rises up is going to be inside that environment where that person might be empowered. So again, back to SynBio. Nobody, I don't think, is going to become a synthetic biologist so that after they get their PhD and do their postdoc and their professorship and they get great access to a lab that will have 20 years from now technology, they'll be able to in the world. No. Well, we have to worry about somebody in that inner sanctum snapping and then doing something within a span of probably a few days to weeks to months that is diabolical and catastrophic. And that's a much narrower set of things that could potentially be done because of the inherently narrow time frame. I mean, 99.99 something high percent of synthetic biologists sure as hell don't want this to happen. They will come up with and be able to access ideas that you and I can't because they're expert in their technology. I mean, one relatively simple thing that's already being done is if somebody is requesting a printout of a pathogenic sequence of DNA, the system writ large should A, refuse to make that pathogen, and B, alert the authorities. Now, in this early time that we're living in right now, there aren't desktop printers that are capable of making full-blown viruses. But when an organization like Twist Bioscience, which recently went public, they work as a service bureau. And they will provide people with sequences. And when a pathogenic sequence is ordered, I don't know if one ever has been, but my understanding is that the protocol is if one is ever ordered, they ain't going to fill that order, and they're going to help people get to the bottom of what's going on. I think we can rely on the good intentions and the imagination of the crushing majority of people in any given field like synthetic biology to think through those catastrophic scenarios, provided that there is an institutionalized desire to use our imagination in that manner. There's an institutionalized desire to think about the most twisted things people could do with the tools that are coming online before somebody else thinks of those things. And that's why I'm confident that if this imagination, and it's a painful imagination, it would be fun to think these things through, but if that's part of the discipline of SynBio, most of the really crazy things will probably be thought of years in advance. And countermeasures can be taken that aren't that intrusive, but are just clever and foresighted.
There are a couple of ways far-fetched that can imagine out even in the long term. One is we just invent some brand new technology that is defensive in nature. We did that recently with encryption. Encryption is much better for the defender than the attacker. The attacker has to brute force a nearly infinite number of solutions, whereas the defender can very easily protect themselves on digital encryption.
That's a really good example. So that is an asymmetry in which the defender is asymmetrically empowered against an attack.
Exactly. So the question is, can we invent something like that in synthetic biology? Is there an advance to be made, especially if we had a lot of resource and a lot of good people looking at it that could aid the defender?
And let's talk about what not to do. And I think that the top of your list and mine is a technology ban.
Well, it's impossible. The problem is if you ban technology, then a few countries would say, well, we're still going to keep developing technology. Let's say North Korea and China, go for it. Then all you've done is left yourself behind. So the only way to have a technology ban is basically to start World War III.
Yeah. And internally within your own society, it's worth noting that illicit drug labs are both illegal and ubiquitous. This is not something like the creation of a nuclear bomb, which needs to marshal the entire resources of a nation state.
You could be doing amazing synthetic biology in your own living room and the neighbors wouldn't necessarily notice. And the other reason that I'm personally very much opposed to a technology ban is because I look at some of the things that are going on right now in synthetic biology and I find it to be purely exhilarating. I believe that synthetic biology is on the cusp of curing the organ shortage. That's going to relieve so much death and misery from all quarters of this world. It's amazing. I think synthetic biology is going to make clean meat, which is going to be an ethical triumph for conscious systems in general and also for issues like global warming. Synbio is going to accomplish so much. And throttling in its crib would be A, impossible, as you just pointed out, and B, a terrible immorality. It's not something we want to do.
Technology is a coin, and one side of it is immortality, and the other side is annihilation.
That's a very good way of putting it. Did you just come up with that?
Yeah.
I like that. I like that.
I'm a happy libertarian, but I think this is one of those cases where it does make sense for the government to pay attention. It goes back to your original point, which is now the gains are privatized, the losses are socialized, and you're dealing with very catastrophic outcomes. Humanity is a public good.
The survival of humanity is the ultimate public good.
There are other good scenarios. If we want a little bit of hope,
it's time for a little bit of hope.
Supply. If you look at how we connect with our phones all the time, we're much more in tune with other people and their feelings and where they are in their lives and so on. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine that our children will actually get cybernetic implants, which will keep them connected to the internet at all times. So once you're cybernetically implanted and connected to the rest of humanity, you become almost like a cell in a multicellular organism. Now, it's voluntary. It's not some involuntary, horrible thing, but now your friends and family and loved ones can see your mood and see when you're about to detonate, for example. So I think that there are support systems that we can create through technology that will help raise our consciousness to a new level and our connectedness to a new level. I mean, at some point, if somebody tries to end the world, it'll be because they weren't loved enough.
Yeah. And that gets to your other point of let's not make more of these people who get to this horrible, horrible point. Easy as it would be to have feelings of hatred for Andres Lubitz, the pilot for Germanwings. This was a person who was in horrible agony and pain and suffering and did something reprehensible. We should not create people like that. If we're
Absolutely.
at a gentler society or if social media behaves in a more supportive and less tearing down way, fewer and fewer people are going to be pushed in that direction.
Before, we used to find love and longing in our family and our tribe, and now we live in cities disconnected from our ancestors and our immediate family. And we're looking for ways to connect. We're looking to create new tribes and new families, and I think people are using all tools at their disposal to do that. Burning Man is kind of this crazy festival in the desert where people go and connect with 70,000 strangers as if they're family. They're radically inclusive. And a society like that is just going to have a lot fewer people detonating. And if they do, they can be easily intercepted and noticed and cared for. Generally when someone is depressed and they kill themselves, deeply internally they feel alone. And so we are headed towards a society of more and more connectedness, whether it's through meditation, whether it's through spirituality, whether it's through psychedelics, whether it's through consciousness festivals, whether it's through parties, whether it's through social media, whether it's through the internet, whether it's through cell phones. It doesn't matter. But the more connected we can be as humans, the better off we are.
And I think there's also less reluctance to use certain tools that might be very powerful in counteracting these things. So when we think in terms of these 1,000 people who detonate annually, even if society or a government takes the most self-centered approach to that, the inevitable conclusion is that things like treatment-resistant depression and treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress are societal dangers. They don't just present a danger to the person who is suffering from PTSD or suffering from treatment-resistant depression, but they could present a danger to anybody in the movie theater if they go nuts with a machine gun, or perhaps anybody in the world if they go crazy with a DNA synthesizer in 30 years. And it seems that there are some pretty powerful tools to fight these things. There are advanced phase 3 trials in Europe using psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, showing enormous amount of promise. And I interviewed the people behind that experiment in an earlier episode of this podcast. And simultaneously in the United States, there is a phase 3 trial going on under the auspices of the FDA, testing the potential for MDMA, Molly or ecstasy, in treating treatment-resistant PTSD. And we got this societal aversion to using these chemicals in any kind of a clinical setting in the wake of the 60s because of the horror that the psychedelic era imposed on certain elements of society.
It's insane that we take any substance that's bioactive when you take it in your mouth and it causes a change in your feelings and we ban it. And the reality is some of these make you much better off. So if you have a chance of detonating, I would rather the society spirits you off into a beautiful farm somewhere to hang out in the fields and do all the psilocybin and MDMA that you need until you basically get through accelerated therapy. That's worth it.
MDMA actually dates back to World War I. That's when the molecule was first created. And psilocybin, I think, was discovered by non-indigenous cultures around the 50s. LSD was first synthesized in the 1930s. These are very much in their 0.9 form. And then we banned any kind of clinical research into their potential, not only their potential, but into their modification and their enhancement. Imagine if all the muscle and budget and imaginative resources that the pharmaceutical industry has available to it, if they had spent 30 or 40 years trying to create the 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 versions of these molecules that we stumbled into back during World War I. Given that these seem to have tremendous potential against PTSD, depression, and other things, we would probably have far more effective remedies today. Well, it seems that kind of development and invention and imagination is about to be applied to these fields. Maybe that is something that can radically reduce the number of people who are inclined to detonate.
And I think related to that, meditation is making a huge surge in the Western world. And actually, the reason I was slightly late when you came today was because my meditation was too good. So I ignored the timer when it went off.
Fantastic.
And I kept going. And that's not to humble brag or anything. It's just that I've just found that if you can really get into it, it's so good that it just brings a sense of peace and joy into your life that no one can take from you. Yeah. And it's a shame that it's not really on offer, like let's say in high school. Right?
Yeah. Why not just be part of gym class for 10 weeks?
Yeah, it's exercising your mind. But we don't teach that skill. It doesn't cost anything. You don't need anything. And it's probably better than most drugs over a long period of time. And it's better than most therapies, I would even argue, at least from my personal experience. So I think these kinds of consciousness-raising tactics combined with prudence, scenario planning, restricting access on some things that individuals just should not have access to, creating a shared vocabulary, popularizing the concepts so that essentially every human has their own immune response to this and understands it, identifying when people are taking privatized gains and socializing the losses, calling that out and saying, hey, there's no amount of skin in the game you can have that makes it worthwhile because you're putting our skin in the game without our permission.
Yeah, making that like the ultimate crime, creating an enormous amount of social awareness and also social shame around socializing a cost.
You know, I give credit to people like Elon Musk for starting to speak out on it, and he's financed the OpenAI project and thinks he's going to get us to Mars, but that's not enough. Yeah. He actually should even talk louder. He does talk. I really appreciate that.
And thank God for that, but we need 10 more like him or 1,000 more like him.
We need 1,000 more like him.
So the antibodies that we can muster, first of all, a gentler society that has fewer people detonating, fewer people killing themselves, fewer people being lonely, is using the tools and allowing the pharmaceutical industry to develop the tools that are most promising in this area.
What if we rated pharmaceuticals on how much they lowered suicide risk?
Yeah, maybe the fact that a very significant external risk is being posed by these types of mental states could raise the urgency around it.
I would also vote to have a Manhattan Project around the kinds of scanners that George Church was talking about.
Bioscanners, things that give very, very early warnings.
We need to take it to the next level.
The other thing is some people could listen to this talk and say, well, the last thing we want to do is have CRISPR education in high schools. I actually say the first thing we want to do is have CRISPR education in high schools. I think we need to acknowledge that the vast majority of people are good guys rather than bad guys. I mean, I've researched it pretty carefully. I can think of 4 instances in which commercial pilots have downed their planes, intentionally killing everybody on board. That's over a span of decades. There are tens of thousands of commercial flights every single day. The crushing, overwhelming majority of commercial pilots obviously refrain from doing that, even though they could. The crushing majority of synthetic biologists would refrain from doing that if they could. And if part of their training was also thinking about what one bad seed might possibly do, if that was part of the discipline of synbio, then the more synthetic biologists we have, the safer we are, not the more endangered we are.
Right.
We just need to have that imagination, slightly paranoid imagination, yes, but that imagination, those ghost stories, those nightmares, be part of the training process. And that's how we create an immune system that can prevent this.
And these will pay benefits even if there is not an incident like the one we're talking about.
Totally.
You'll have less colds, you'll have less Ebola, you'll have less of every kind of virus and bacteria spreading.
I guess a big question is whether people and society writ large want to mentally engage with these dangers for decades. I mean, all the time we spent envisioning nuclear winter might have saved our lives, but it wasn't exactly fun.
Yeah, I think just like there's a tendency to not look at the screen in a horror movie and to not want to get bad news and to shoot the messenger for bad news. It's built into us as humans, an instinct to face away from it, to deny it.
Much as I enjoy hanging out with you, I think this has been a very fun conversation.
No, this is not going to be a viral podcast, no pun intended, because I think people don't want to spread bad news or even bad thoughts because people think that if I don't think the bad thoughts, it won't happen. But think of it sort of like as the Union for Concerned Scientists came up after nuclear weapons were invented. These were people who knew them well, they knew what they were capable of, and they did their best to get the message out. They built the doomsday clock. They worked tirelessly against nuclear proliferation. They did come up with the horror scenarios of nuclear winter ending all life on the earth and so on. And they had to popularize that. And, yes, there were some overreactions. There were kids doing drills, running into the basement and hiding underneath their desks in case of a nuclear strike. But we needed that to get the message of nuclear non-proliferation out there very, very strongly. And I would argue that nuclear proliferation is a genie that has been kept in the bottle to a much greater degree than anyone imagined in the 1950s.
Against all odds. I mean, what smart observer in 1946 would have imagined that 70 plus years would go by without a nuclear weapon being fired in anger?
Right. So it's better to have a slow, measured, trained immune system response than wait until something happens. Then there's a cytokine storm. Then there's multiple wars, surveillance, crackdowns, police state. That's not where we want to end up. We want to be a free and civil society. And so that means having a measured approach to these rather than having a reactive approach to these.
The nuclear example is an incredibly powerful one and triples my confidence that hopefully getting this term ender out there in a way that people understand the term and spread it, and hopefully people not shunning this odious, grim conversation that we've had and spreading it to some degree can spread the kind of awareness that we need. I mean, one of the most amazing things in geopolitical history, in my opinion, was in 1990-91, after the fall of the Soviet Union, 4 newly born countries voluntarily denuclearized. I think it was Ukraine, Kazakhstan, maybe Uzbekistan, and I think one of the other post-Soviet republics had nukes on their land. And how improbable, when you think about it, for 4 countries, that's probably more countries than have nuclearized since 1990. I think there's really only been 3, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. And the reason that they did that, this crazy geopolitical move, was because humanity had spent 45 years telling itself ghost stories about what could happen and what we wanted to avoid. And that's an amazing, nigh miraculous thing that did happen because we were brave enough to think about it and worry about it. So these disaster modeling exercises, which are kind of like prophylactic nightmares, can be very effective. And of course, let's hope the synbio nightmares and the AI nightmares we're promoting right now will look like totally unnecessary exercises 50 years from now, kind of like the duck and cover drills that schools used to do during the Cold War. But we're happy when precautions turn out to be unnecessary. I mean, if we fasten the seatbelt when we start our car, we're not annoyed if we don't get into an accident.
There's a great Arabic aphorism that I love that says, trust in Allah, but tie your camel.
It's good. Well, thank you so much for spending so much time and having such a crazy brainstorming conversation with me.
Thanks. On the one hand, I hope we didn't terrify people. On the other hand, I kind of hope we did wake them up a little bit.
Yeah, it's time for us to start thinking about this stuff. Thank you for listening to that, at times disturbing, but I'm convinced very significant conversation with Naval Ravikant. A full transcript of it, with certain interesting points highlighted, can be found at my website at after-on.com, and you're welcome to post it, excerpt it, and generally distribute it in any way you see fit. And if the things we said resonated with you at all, I hope you'll consider joining a long, slow, steady campaign to preclude the arrival of an actual ender. Yes, this is something we get to do as a society if we put our minds to it early enough and in a level-headed way. But this won't be easy, nor will it just happen on its own. At least 1,000 suicidal mass murderers detonate every year, and technology will continue to arm them with ever more powerful weapons. Scholars have referred to these folks as the apocalyptic residual, which might make a pretty cool movie title. Naval and I use the words ender and enderlings, But whatever you call them, no amount of wishful thinking is going to cause them to suddenly vanish. Now, some well-meaning people discouraged me from having this conversation in public lest we give would-be enders ideas. But I'm afraid they already have ideas, ones they've had from time immemorial, and they're acting on them every year on every continent and in every type of society. The one thing that's changing relentlessly and quite structurally is the technology that some subset of them can access. If ever there was a situation in which hope is not a strategy, this is it. So what's a more grown-up way to confront this? Step one is simply spreading level-headed awareness of the dangers on a very, very broad level. There's an infantilizing notion out there that only certified experts have a right to an opinion or a seat at the table when these sorts of risks are contemplated. Naval mentioned this when he described certain self-styled AI experts who believe that no one outside their own narrow clique should have any voice in how AI is developed. To quote Upton Sinclair again, the pitfall is, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." Antique and overly gender-specific as that language may be, this is an important and powerful point. We left it to experts with highly distorted personal incentives to both run and watch over our financial system. Turned out to be a bad idea. Much more recently, we decided that only experts at places like Facebook could truly understand and safeguard our digital privacy. I think it's reasonable to conclude that experts with upside shouldn't be handed a monopoly over the governance of anything, and certainly not when billions of lives could be on the line. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that there's no role for experts in conversations like this. Obviously, there is an enormous one. It just isn't a monopoly role, for them or for anybody. So as we face the bedeviling risks that an ancient glitch in human nature will pose when it joins forces with near-future technology, what do we have on our side? Well, first of all, we definitely have the numbers. Suicidal mass murderers are a minuscule fringe of society, literally less than one person in a million in any given year, and they're no more likely than anybody else to be geniuses. So the odds of one of them conjuring up a masterfully diabolical plan that the rest of us are too thick to foresee are basically non-existent. But our huge numerical advantage will mean nothing if we're not broadly engaged in this risk and instead delegate it to a small conference room full of experts with upside in a think tank somewhere. The second thing we've got on our side is that the real dangers are at least a decade away, and maybe quite a bit more than that. So we have a huge jump on a diabolical actor who might strike when the time has truly come. Some of these people may not even have been born yet. But again, to use time to our huge advantage, we have to put our imaginations and our analytical horsepower to work now, and not the day after a horrifying near miss has been inflicted on the world. Because the first strike really may not miss. So to help interdict the dangers here, a very simple thing you could do is spread the word. Tweet, blog, or otherwise discuss this episode if the arguments resonated with you. If you're a podcaster yourself and would like to literally rebroadcast this conversation as one of your own episodes, please reach out to me on Twitter or through my website. I'd be delighted to accommodate you. This is a worthy conversation to have with your own listeners. And borrowing this episode could also get you a week off from production, which I know from personal experience can be a godsend. And if Naval and I just didn't do it for you, there are plenty of other resources out there that you can spread around instead. Countless people are now discussing these risks in public forums, so join the conversation and spread the word in whatever manner is most natural to you. Because if these risks are as widely understood, discussed, analyzed, and dreaded as nuclear winter was during the Cold War, we will have come a long, long way toward precluding them. Now, for those of you who are really ambitious and scientifically minded, you could take it a giant step further and become a synthetic biologist or work in some other field connected to existential dangers. As I said during the episode, the more synthetic biologists we have, the safer we are, because the crushing majority of them will be good guys, not bad guys. So consider joining this amazing field. Maybe you'll help deliver on some of its extraordinary promise for humanity, or become a hero who helps build a critical piece of protective infrastructure that one day saves innumerable lives. I'll leave you with that thought, as well as an encouragement to join me again in April, when my guests will include one of the world's leading AI researchers and analysts on AI risk, Stuart Russell. And also in April, Stanford's Carrie Nadeau, an immunologist with a global reputation who's helping to lead the battle to defeat food allergies, which don't represent an existential risk to society, but certainly do represent such a risk to a frighteningly large and fast-growing population. If you're new to the show, I'd also urge you to browse its archives at after-on.com, where you'll find dozens of conversations with brilliant thinkers, founders, and scientists working in fields like neuroscience, synthetic biology, of course, astrophysics, cryptocurrency, quantum computing, and many others. People who are reshaping our understanding and our mastery of reality on a daily basis. This show was 100% listener-supported from its inception until about 3 weeks ago when I got my first sponsor. And while I'm delighted with that development, it's anyone's guess as to when I'll have a second sponsor, because I have an unusually high bar for the types of sponsorship or advertising I want to expose you to. Having talked about it in earlier episodes, I won't go into detail now, but if you feel like investing in the show's longevity and also accessing dozens of hours of special material that I make available to supporters, including 2 very recent interviews with Naval himself, please visit my page at patreon.com/RobReed. And finally, the simplest, fastest, and absolutely cost-free way to support this show is to rate it or review it in iTunes or in Apple's Podcasts app or any other podcasting app that you happen to use. This takes just seconds, but has a real impact on discovery algorithms and therefore how many people I reach, which itself will have a very large bearing on the show's staying power. That's it for now. Please join me again in April.